Welcome to a special joint edition of the Green Planet Monitor and Reason to Resist. Joining me in a conversation with a most distinguished guest, Reason to Resist host Dimitri Lascaris. Hey, Dimitri.
David, always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Our distinguished guest, Richard Falk, Professor Emeritus of International Law at Princeton University. Richard Falk has authored numerous books and articles about international law, human rights, and the United Nations system from both scholarly and activist perspectives. He has taught at Ohio State, Harvard, Princeton University, and other universities around the world. Richard Falk has been Albert G. Milbank Professor of International Law and Practice at Princeton since 1965, 2 years prior to the start of Israel's unlawful 58-year occupation of Palestine. Between 2008 and 2014, Falk served as UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in occupied Palestine. He's now currently the Senior Vice President of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. He's working on a collaborative project to establish a Center for Climate Justice and Ecocide Prevention, and he's president of the Gaza Tribunal, a people's tribunal on U.S.-Israeli genocide in Gaza that wrapped up its final session in Istanbul in late October. Now, there's not much Richard Falk hasn't done or experienced. Prior to November 13th, he'd never been taken to that little room at a big airport and interrogated for hours about the national security threat border agents thought he might pose. That day, Falk was heading to Ottawa to attend the Palestine Tribunal on Canadian responsibility. It was Richard Falk's 95th birthday. Richard Falk, welcome to this joint edition of the GPM and Reason to Resist, and happy belated birthday.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction.
Richard, tell us what happened that day, Thursday, November 13th. It was your 95th birthday. You were planning on celebrating the birthday at some point. You ended up getting held for 4 hours and interrogated by these guys. Tell us what happened exactly and what questions they asked you and how they treated you.
Well, they initially took my passport and that of my wife, who was traveling with me and participating in the conference in Ottawa also, and asked us to follow the immigration official to a room that was manned by Canadian border security uh, agents, or the border security. It was under the authority of the Border Security Agency. And we waited for quite a long time. There were other people waiting in this holding area until we were asked again to follow, this time a border security person who took us to a larger room, which was completely empty, and asked us to sit at a desk and wait for the interrogating officer to appear. And we waited probably a half hour at that point. He came and told us that we were being detained at this point because the government had to determine whether we were a security threat and, as such, excludable from entering Canada. He then proceeded to ask some very preliminary questions about had I ever been to Canada before. And when I said I had, he asked me to give details about what I was doing in past visits and what the events were and what my role was and whether I was being paid for these appearances. I told him that, among other things, that I'd been in Canada many times over the years. I had a son practicing law in Vancouver, and I visited him quite often and participated in university and other events, lived in Montreal for a semester while my wife had a Fulbright fellowship there. And then he said, on the basis of these answers, I have to go and talk to my boss. And so he left us in this empty room again, this time for really over an hour, and then came back and asked a bit more focused questions on Gaza and on my views on Israel Palestine. And did I know that I had been accused of being an anti Semite? And various sort of unhinged questions that didn't seem to have any sense of direction. I mean,
Did you tell him you were Jewish?
uh, I don't remember. I think so, or he knew it, or I don't remember the. It was obviously a part of the conversation.
Mhm.
He was respectful and polite throughout. It was not in any way a hostile grilling, uh, and it led me to think that they weren't really interested in determining whether I was a threat to national security, that it had something to do with maybe an uncertainty among the upper echelon Canadian officials, or whether to try to interfere with this tribunal in Ottawa, which ended up being canceled by the University of Ottawa, where where it was originally scheduled to take place, but then it was immediately reassigned to a meeting room of the Canadian Senate and under the patronage of one of the senators. And so it actually attained more visibility. While we were detained, the people organizing the event in Ottawa learned of our detention, and they in turn mounted a certain interference in the Prime Minister's office. And I had a former student, Lloyd Axworthy, who had been Prime Minister, Foreign Minister of Canada some 20 years ago. And we were friends. He intervened.
Lloyd Axworthy intervened on your behalf.
Yes, I mean, he's not in a public arena, but in talking with people in the Prime Minister's office, I think. And we had lunch while the conference, on the second day of the conference.
And I mean, this conference, we'll talk about this at the very end, but this conference ended up being about, was about Canadian complicity in U.S.-Israeli genocide in Gaza. So clearly the Canadian government is a little uncomfortable having the finger pointed at it, people saying it's complicit in genocide, much less at a conference in Ottawa.
Yes, and it was an event organized and initiated by a group of young Canadians that had formed some kind of NGO about just advocacy, in international affairs, not particularly focused on Israel-Palestine. But they did a very good job. This was the most concerted, high quality inquiry into the complicity issue. There was an earlier event of the similar kind organized by Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, which had also a sort of connection with the House of Commons. It was in one of its meeting rooms, but it was not nearly as well orchestrated. The program was less impressive, less clearly focused on the complicity issues,
So,
but it went along the same lines.
so, Richard, I have a number of quick questions for you about what happened at the airport. And by the way, Lloyd Axworthy, your former student, by the standards of recent foreign ministers, is rather concerned about compliance with international law. And in fact, just about a week ago, the current foreign minister, Anita Anand, from the same party as Lloyd Axworthy, the Liberal Party, was asked whether she believed that the U.S. military's attacks on civilian vessels in the Caribbean was a violation of international law. And she declined to answer, saying it's for the United States government to decide that, even
Yeah.
though in September she gave a speech at the UN in which she openly accused Russia of violating the UN Charter. In any case, Lloyd Axworthy just a day ago was quoted extensively in a newspaper called the Hill Times in Ottawa, which is widely read by the political class in Canada. And he was very critical of Minister Anand, again, from the same political party as he is, about the fact that she wasn't willing to condemn the United States government for those attacks in Caribbean waters. So I think you appear to have had quite a positive impact on Lloyd Axworthy, if I may say so. But because really it's unusual to see a former Canadian foreign minister be so outspoken about criticizing a colleague, especially from the same political party. In any case, what I wanted to ask you quickly before we move on to the next subject is, I understand you were asked about the Palestinian right to resist by this official at Toronto Pearson Airport. Is that correct? And if so, how did you respond?
Well, yes, he asked me as if it was a provocative question whether I had supported a Palestinian right to resist. And I said I did, and added that this was a right that was embedded in international law fairly recently during the main anti-colonial struggles of the 1960s and 70s and 80s, but it was clearly spelled out in a General Assembly resolution on principles governing coexistence, which was an attempt to set a framework of law during the Cold War. And one of the things that they agreed upon was that the self-determination of a people included its right to resist colonial domination and other forms of abusive control that constituted international criminality. And the apartheid finding is relevant in that regard, that all the main human rights NGOs have concluded with a good deal of documentation that indeed Israel has imposed a matrix of control that violates the anti-apartheid uh, International Convention of 1972.
Mhm.
It doesn't claim to be the same kind of racism and abuse that was practiced in South Africa, but it has the same general features of domination and exploitation and dehumanization of the uh, uh, subjugated people.
Mhm. Now, in 2017, as I recall, in fact, I've read this report many times, you and Professor Virginia Tilley co-authored a study on apartheid, the question of apartheid in occupied Palestine. And I recall your conclusion was that the evidence that Israel is committing the crime of apartheid is overwhelming. And what really struck me about that is that you opened up the floodgates because after you and Professor Tilley issued that report, then came the similar opinions of Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights group Yesh Din. Then I believe your successor, the UN Special Rapporteur Michael Link, opined that Israel was committing apartheid. So you and Professor Tilley were I think, ahead of the curve and appear to have had quite an impact on the discussion around Israeli apartheid. But and I commend you for that, Professor Falk, because I've referred to that study many times in my own work as a lawyer. Um, a couple of quick questions before we move on. So your partner, uh, Elver Hilal, is also an accomplished international scholar. She too, like you, was a former UN Special Rapporteur, except in her case it was with respect to the right to food. You were the rapporteur for the Human Rights situation in occupied Palestine. Did they separate you at any point in this interrogation, or were you together the entire time?
We were together the entire time. And
Uh-huh.
as I say, they treated it with a certain informality, as though they weren't really serious about the
Right.
uh, uh, substantiating whatever allegation had led them to detain us in the first place. It was very peculiar. I have been interrogated, especially the last time I tried to go to Israel, and it was a very different type of experience.
Were
Mhm.
you surprised before Dimitri moves on with the second area of questioning, knowing what you know about Canada, Canadian foreign policy, Canadian adherence to the norms of international humanitarian and human rights law? I mean, Canada's a totally upstanding country. I'm being a little ironic. Were you surprised? Were you taken aback?
I was surprised. I wasn't totally shocked because these things are happening in different parts of the world through pressure from Washington and from uh, intelligence, communications. And I didn't know what the basis of this initiative was. And I think it's got all this attention because it was Canada. If it had happened in Los Angeles or New York, I think it would have been seen as what can you expect these days, and not cause much reflection. And of course, not all the reflection has been positive. I've been attacked, and the tribunal in Ottawa was attacked by the Zionist press, and
Mhm.
that was not a surprise.
And since you mentioned, the policies of the current U.S. administration, do you have any reason to believe, did anything happen in this interaction which caused you to suspect that this had something to do with the Trump administration, that U.S. authorities had notified Canadians that you were coming, that they wanted to subject you to some kind of questioning, or you saw no indication of that?
I saw no indication of that, and I was really surprised. I feared that there would be an obstructive greeting for us when we came from Istanbul 2 weeks ago, because there I had been president of this tribunal, and the tribunal was explicitly in opposition to the positions taken by the U.S. government, including in its Trump period, this second Trump period. And it seemed that if Francesca Albanese was going to be sanctioned for her reporting under UN auspices and as a harassed non American citizen, to be subjected to this kind of punitive response seemed to me to indicate a strong possibility that we would be stopped when we came to LAX, but nothing, absolutely nothing happened. I never got into the U.S. with less bureaucratic
Mhm.
complexity.
Maybe
So,
they were trying to cause you to become to lower your guard when you came to Canada. So let's let's
it,
move on. Sorry, if you wanted to say add anything, I was going to move on to the next subject. But if anything else you wanted to add about this experience,
well, as I've been trying to say, it had a very unprofessional quality to it. And for that reason, seemed to me puzzling what was really motivating it. I don't think it was a serious intention to determine whether we were security risks. I think there was something else in the background that they were either unclear about or they felt that somehow detaining or denying us entry might help their effort to contain the impact of the event, the tribunal in Ottawa.
right? So let's turn then, Professor Falk, to the events at the United Nations Security Council this past Monday, November 17th, when the Security Council, by a margin of 13-0, with the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China abstaining, passed a resolution which effectively endorsed, uh, uh, and I suppose we could say legitimized from an international law perspective, or sought to legitimize this so-called peace plan formulated by the Trump administration in concert with various Arab autocracies and apparently the Israeli government. And just so people who are not familiar with it, I'll just quickly identify the key features. There will be a peace board, which will supervise a Palestinian technocratic uh, government put in place. The United States government, principally Donald Trump, will stand at the apex of this hierarchy that they've established. They're not only to supervise the technocratic government, this peace board is to supervise the delivery of humanitarian aid and the International Stabilization Force. They also established, or at least in broad terms, mandated the creation of such a force. The resolution doesn't identify what countries will provide troops, but it does direct the International Stable Force to demilitarize Gaza. There are no provisions in this resolution relating to the demilitarization of Israel. There's no provision in there for Israel to be held accountable, to pay reparations, to fund reconstruction. I could go on and on. To sum it all up, Professor Falk, I now refer to this resolution as the abomination. Perhaps your judgment is not quite as harsh as mine, but I think David and I would be most interested in hearing what your overall assessment of this resolution is and what you think it means for the future of the United Nations Security Council.
Well, it is a very strange development. Uh, the UN had been blamed or generated great sense of disappointment because it didn't stop the genocide. Now it's in the position through this Security Council Resolution 2803 of rewarding the two countries that were guilty of genocide with control over the supposed restoration of a stable set of circumstances in Gaza, which would be divided between this American controlled southern part of Gaza and the Israeli occupation continuing in the northern part of Gaza, which would be the only part in the initial phase anyway that would receive donor contributions for the restoration, physical restoration of this part of Gaza. I regard it as a bigger disappointment than the earlier failure to address genocide in a effective manner. Here, I think not only the UN as an institution, but a range of its members, including from the global south, endorsed this proposal that is perverted both by reference to international law, international morality, and the prior pronouncements of the UN General Assembly, the International Court of Justice, both integral elements of the UN.
And 2803 doesn't make any reference whatsoever to all those international legal instruments or to
No,
past UN Security Council resolutions.
or to any kind of notion of Israeli accountability or the accountability of complicit countries. It doesn't even say these questions will be reserved for future adjudication or future deliberation by the appropriate organs. It could have said things that at least kept the sense that it was not totally doing what Washington was asking it to do. And so I think it's a very bad sign of geopolitical subordination by the UN and its membership to the leverage that the US, despite everything, is still able to exercise.
Professor Falk, you often see in decisions of the International Court of Justice, they will refer to resolutions of the UN Security Council as a source of law. But I've seen that numerous experts in international law, and I concur with their opinion as a lawyer, express the view that this resolution exceeds the boundaries of international law and is, to borrow the Latin phrase, ultra vires. In other words, beyond the competence or jurisdiction of the UN Security Council, which would imply that it's null and void. It's not a valid expression of international law. Do you share that view? Do you see this as being beyond the competence of the UN Security Council, and therefore the resolution is null and void as a legal matter?
I'm not sure that that's the best way to delimit the argument against the legal status or legal authority of the resolution. I think there's very little background for invalidating a UN Security Council resolution. But I think that here you have a very strong case for reasons that you alluded to, including the absence of reference to the International Court of Justice findings, the advisory opinions that say Israel has no no legal basis for continuing occupying either any part of Gaza or the West Bank for that matter. I think a more nuanced argument could be developed that would carry greater weight if the General Assembly, for instance, refers the challenge to the legality of the resolution to the ICJ for an advisory opinion, which it could do.
Do you have any reason to believe that that's going to happen? Do you have your sources indicate that some government out there is thinking about doing that?
They certainly should be thinking about it. I haven't any specific assurance that that's happening.
Right.
And it would in effect, if it was supported by an important group of countries, at least revalidate the UN as an organization that was capable of dealing with diverse perspectives.
But under the United Nations Charter, if the Security Council decides that it wants to establish an international stabilization force, it would do this under Chapter 7. It would be enforceable, and that the Security Council would and its members would take responsibility themselves for enforcing the resolution. But what's so bizarre about this 2803 is that there is no accountability to anybody other than the Board of Peace, which is chaired by Donald Trump. So it almost seems to me as if the UN Security Council has been hijacked by the Trump administration. Your thoughts on that? And I'm wondering, like, why would they have allowed themselves to be hijacked? I mean, Russia and China abstained. They could have vetoed, but they didn't. They just abstained. But the rest of them, they just allowed the council to be hijacked.
Yes, I think that Russia and China abstained because they think of trying to keep the geopolitical rivalry under control is more important than siding with Palestine in this very controversial context. I don't agree with that assessment, but I can understand it as based on geopolitical calculations by both Beijing and Moscow. As far as the rest of the countries that voted for this resolution, one is really at a loss to describe how they came to accept this sort of pressure, whether they were induced or to what extent this was their sense this is the only way to end the genocide, or it's better than nothing, some kind of reasoning to that effect, or I imagine the U.S. diplomacy included the fact that if this plan doesn't succeed, the genocide in its most virulent forms will be resumed, and we will fully support that. See, I think that was the lever that influenced wavering governments to go along with this kind of resolution.
Professor Falk, on my program, and this is true of David as well, we often talk about international law. And recently, I get a lot of commentary on our videos. And recently, I'm hearing more and more from members of our audience that what is the point? What's the point of even talking about international law? There's no enforcement. It's cynically manipulated by the powerful, turned against the weak as a weapon. and a weapon of oppression. And therefore, this is just a waste of time even talking about international law. How would you respond to that sentiment?
No, I've dealt with that issue quite a bit. First of all, I think it's important to clarify that international law works well and is taken for granted in broad areas of international life. That the problematic area is, of course, the most important, which embraces global security, genocide prevention, and I suppose apartheid and ecocide prevention. And in those domains, the UN was designed in a way to fail because there was no other reason to give the most powerful countries in the world, the winners of World War II, a, a right to veto any decision that collided with their strategic interests. So it was an overt concession to the primacy of geopolitics. And that, of course, reproduced the pre-UN world order, which was based on great power balances and discretionary uses of force, so that this kind of redefinition of what was acceptable behavior by this controversial resolution is a real step backward in international practice and in the performative roles that the UN has. But facing the deeper question of why bother with international law because it's not enforced and it's rarely had a substantive impact on the behavior of these geopolitical actors. And I have several answers to that apparent issue of dismissing international law altogether. One of the functions that international law played throughout this crisis was to legitimate civil society activism. The results of what happened in the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court and the defiance of Israel and the support of that defiance by the US and other supportive countries strengthened the activist view that only the people could stop the genocide, that the UN was powerless to do so. So the legitimation of civil society activism is, I think, a very important element, and it was important in the fight against apartheid in South Africa, that that's where the whole idea of BDS got its start, really. And it has made a difference. Israel has emerged from these 2 years of genocide as a pariah state, where there are all sorts of individual and collective measures of solidarity with the Palestinian struggle or the mounting of pressure against their own government have taken place. civil society is now an active arena of Palestinian struggle, which it wasn't earlier. And whether that makes a difference is not clear at this point.
Mhm.
And it would seem here in Canada that one of the objectives of Prime Minister Carney in recognizing the state of Palestine alongside Britain and France and the rest of them is to put forward this image of themselves as actually doing something about the problem, upholding the Palestinian people's inalienable right to self-determination. So they're going to recognize the state of Palestine conditionally, and that it's basically performative and meant to kind of appease public opinion in Canada, which is pretty negative towards Israel's genocide. And yet, at the same time, Canada extends aid and assistance routinely, systematically, institutionally to Israel's occupation of Palestine. It's obliged under Common Article 1 of the Fourth Geneva Convention to respect and ensure respect for the convention in all circumstances. And I think I can go through the Geneva Convention, Fourth Convention, and not find a single provision that Israel is not in violation of. And some of those are flagrant breaches. And Canada extends aid and assistance to them.
Yes,
Canada actually supports the settlement enterprise, all the while, and saying, settlements block a two-state solution, all the while, and then recognizing the state of Palestine, all the while supporting settlements. So it's for me, it's personally frightening to see the extent to which countries like Canada say one thing and then do the other, that it's the law of the jungle, that there is no law.
there is no law that's uniformly accepted in this area of global security. You have to qualify it in that way because there, as I say, most of international life is dependent upon a reliable structure of law and its enforcement and respect. And where international law works is where the logic of reciprocity applies. In other words, uh, Canada will the uh, treat diplomats from smaller countries with due respect because it wants its diplomats to be treated with similar respect elsewhere. Same in relation to many trade and investment relationships, tourism, maritime safety, air safety, lots of things that are successfully regulated by international law. So it's unfortunate from one perspective that international law is in these kind of debates exclusively reduced in its coverage to the one area it is failing in. And as I say, that's the most important area, but it was part of the winner's design after 1945. It didn't come about through some kind of institutional departure from that earlier winners winners take all peace process that follows traditionally major wars.
Do you believe that there's any prospect of democratizing the United Nations, Professor Falk? And if so, what do you think is the most effective and hopeful path for doing that?
Well, I think the most hopeful paths would be to empower the General Assembly to act without the level of deference that it has shown to the Security Council, and that it should be seen as an independent decision-making body within the UN system that represents the peoples of the world in a way the Security Council cannot hope to do and doesn't pretend to do.
Mhm.
So I think that's one area. The other area would be to remove the label of advisory opinion from the questions put to the court by the UN system itself, and include the very important advisory opinion issued on July 19th, 2024, that declared the entire Israeli occupation to be unlawful by reference to the Geneva Conventions that David was referring to, and yet and gave Israel 1 year to withdraw completely from any pretension of occupying the Palestinian territories. But the media bias is such that that's hardly known as part of what was previously decreed under an authoritative, near unanimous international court decision. So making the court more entitled to expect enforcement of it's not international law that's failing, it's the enforcement, which is a deliberately left to a political process by being assigned to the Security Council where the veto prevails.
And the Uniting for Peace resolution? Do you think that the Uniting for Peace resolution can be finally implemented by the General Assembly, bringing together states who are prepared to actually undertake comprehensive sanctions against Israel, maybe even an intervention of their own?
One has to be somewhat skeptical as to whether the political will is deep enough to sustain the burdens and the possible adverse consequences of taking that kind of position in opposition to Israel and the US. And so far, there hasn't been evidence, including in the Muslim majority states and the Arabs' neighbors, of a sufficient political will to go beyond words of condemnation to actions of even censure, much less sanctions.
Well, Professor Falk, you've been very generous with your time, and we thank you so much for sharing with us your curious experiences at Toronto Pearson Airport. We hope that you'll never have to endure such nonsense again. But perhaps if anybody within the Canadian government is watching our discussion today, they can enlighten us as to why they chose to disturb you on your 95th birthday. With
No,
that, David, sorry, go ahead.
I'm fearful of what will happen on my 96th.
Inshallah. So,
Do you want to quickly tell us, Richard, what was the upshot of this 2 day session that got moved from the University of Ottawa because they were concerned about security issues? They were obviously pushed to cancel and moved to the Senate. Your quick comments on the upshot of the 2 day session last week?
Well, I think it's compiled a very compelling record on what constitutes complicity and why it should be repudiated by Canada from the perspective of binding human rights standards. And I think you have in that compilation of testimonies by Palestinians, by experts, by individual journalists, doctors, so on, you have a basis for a real campaign to hold complicit countries legally responsible, perhaps even for even for an assessed contribution to the restoration of Gaza. It's unclear what would happen. One has no expectation that Israel or the U.S. are about to comply with anything that comes from the UN that's adverse to their preferred positions. So it's a standoff at this stage,
Right.
with the UN seeming to capitulate on the crucial question of how a transition beyond the genocidal experience of the last 2 years is to be achieved.
David, do you have any other follow-up questions, or shall we call it?
No, I don't. I mean, I was kind of wondering, Dimitri. I mean, no one knows more than you about the challenges of actually holding the Canadian government accountable under law for its actions. For example, its complicity in genocide. It's very difficult.
As a matter of fact, and you may be interested to know, Professor Falk, that I'm part of a group of 7 lawyers who've brought a claim against the Canadian government alleging that it's violating Article 1 of the Genocide Convention.
Oh, really?
And
Good.
the Attorney General of Canada has brought a motion to dismiss, citing the Canadian equivalent of the political question doctrine, which defeated, I'm sure you know, a similar case brought by the Center for Constitutional Rights in the United States last year. We don't have quite the same doctrine here, but in any case, we're going to be arguing that motion Thursday of next week in Ottawa.
Oh, good.
So
If there's a text of the argument, please do send it to me.
happy to do that. And we anticipate we'll have a decision sometime in the next few months. In any event, we much appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. And if you found this to be informative, I'm speaking now to our audience. Please do like and share the video. And if you're not a subscriber to Reason to Resist or Green Planet Monitor, we certainly encourage you to become one. And thank you again for joining us today.